3 terrifying forest horror stories. The last one still haunts me to this day. Number 1. We thought the whispers were just the wind until the trees started screaming. It was the summer after high school graduation, and my friends and I decided to celebrate with a weekend camping trip in the Black Forest. We'd heard the stories about the place, how people went missing, how strange lights were sometimes seen between the trees, but we brushed it off as local legends. We were young, invincible, and stupid. The first day was perfect. The sun filtered through the towering pines, and the air was crisp and clean. We set up camp in a small clearing, built a fire, and spent the evening laughing and telling stories. But as night fell, the atmosphere changed. The forest grew unnaturally quiet, as if the animals themselves were holding their breath. I was the first to hear it. A faint whisper, barely audible over the crackling fire. At first I thought it was the wind, but the sound was too deliberate, too rhythmic. I glanced at my friends, but they didn't seem to notice. The whispers grew louder, more distinct, and I realized they were coming from the trees. "Do you hear that?" I asked, my voice trembling. My friends stopped talking and listened. For a moment, there was silence. Then the whispers returned, this time louder, more urgent. They weren't speaking any language I recognized, but the tone was unmistakable. It was a warning. We tried to brush it off, but the unease lingered. That night, as I lay in my tent, the whispers returned. They were closer now, right outside the thin fabric of the tent. I could feel my heart pounding in my chest as I lay there, too afraid to move. The whispers grew louder, more frantic, until they were almost screaming. I don't know how long I lay there, paralyzed with fear, before I finally worked up the courage to unzip the tent and look outside. The fire had died down to embers, casting a faint glow over the clearing. At first, I saw nothing. Then I noticed the trees. Their branches were moving, twisting and writhing like snakes. The whispers were coming from them, their leaves rustling in a language I couldn't understand. I stumbled back into the tent and woke my friends, but by the time they looked outside, the trees were still. We tried to convince ourselves it was just the wind, but deep down we all knew it wasn't. The whispers continued throughout the night, growing louder and more insistent. By morning, we were exhausted, our nerves frayed. We packed up camp as quickly as we could, eager to leave the forest behind. But as we hiked back to the car, the whispers followed us. They seemed to come from every direction, echoing through the trees. We walked faster, our footsteps crunching against the dry leaves, but the whispers kept pace with us. Then we saw it, a figure standing between the trees. It was tall and thin, its body obscured by the shadows. Its face was hidden, but I could feel its gaze on us, cold and unyielding. We froze, our breath caught in our throats as the figure took a step forward. We didn't wait to see what it would do. We ran, crashing through the underbrush, the whispers growing louder behind us. We didn't stop until we reached the car, our hearts pounding, our clothes soaked with sweat. We drove in silence, the weight of what we'd experienced hanging over us like a dark cloud. None of us spoke about it, but I could see the fear in their eyes. To this day, I can still hear those whispers in my dreams, and I wonder what they were trying to tell us. I've never gone back to the Black Forest, and I never will. But sometimes, late at night, when the wind rustles through the trees outside my window, I hear them again, those faint, insistent whispers, calling me back to the woods. If you are enjoying so far, please like and subscribe for more. Story number 2. I wasn't afraid of getting lost until I realized something was following me. It was late October, and I was hiking alone in the Smoky Mountains. The fall foliage was breathtaking, the leaves a fiery mix of red, orange, and yellow. Crisp air filled my lungs, and the earthy scent of damp leaves and pine needles surrounded me. I'd planned to spend the night at a remote campsite deep in the forest, a perfect way to disconnect from everything and embrace the solitude. But as the sun began to set, I realized something was wrong. The trail markers had disappeared. I had been following them all day. confident in my route, but at some point, they had simply vanished. I checked my map and compass, but neither seemed to match what I was seeing. The dense fog rolling in from the mountains made it impossible to see more than a few feet ahead. Every tree looked the same, every path twisted into uncertainty. I wasn't just lost, I was trapped. I tried to retrace my steps, but the forest was eerily silent, the only sound the crunch of leaves beneath my boots. Then, a new sound joined it. Footsteps. At first, I thought it was an echo, my own steps bouncing back through the trees. But as I paused, the footsteps continued. Slow, deliberate, following. I spun around, scanning the shifting fog. Nothing. Just trees and swirling mist. My pulse quickened, but I forced myself to stay calm. It was probably just an animal, maybe a deer or a lost hiker. Still, I picked up my pace, hoping to find a familiar landmark before darkness swallowed the woods entirely. The footsteps kept pace with me, always just far enough away that I couldn't see their source, but close enough that I knew, without a doubt, I wasn't alone. Then I saw it, a figure standing in the fog. It was tall and thin, its features obscured by the mist. It didn't move, didn't make a sound, just stood there, watching. A shiver ran down my spine. "Hello?" My voice barely carried in the heavy air. No response. Something about its stillness was deeply wrong. I turned and walked faster, refusing to break into a run. Running would mean I was afraid. Running would mean I believed it was real. The figure didn't stay behind. As I glanced over my shoulder, it was closer. Not moving, but closer. I ran. Branches whipped against my arms and face, the underbrush snagging my legs, but I didn't stop. The fog thickened, the trees twisting and turning like a maze designed to keep me inside. No matter which way I turned, the forest looked the same, an endless loop of identical trees and swirling mist. Then, as if conjured from the haze itself, I saw a small cabin. The windows were dark, the wooden walls weathered and worn. The door hung slightly ajar, its hinges creaking as the wind passed through. I hesitated for only a second before stepping inside. The air was thick with dust and decay. The scent of rotting wood and something else, something foul, clinging to the walls. I pushed the door shut and barricaded it with a rickety chair, my breath coming in ragged gasps. My heartbeat thundered in my ears. Outside, the forest had gone silent again. The only sound was the slow, creeping whisper of the wind. Then I heard it. A low, guttural laugh. My blood ran cold. It was just outside the cabin, so close I could feel the vibrations of it in my chest. I didn't dare move. Slowly, I crept toward the window and peered out. The figure was there, standing in the fog. Closer now. Its head tilted at an unnatural angle. It took a step forward, and for the first time I could see it clearly. It wasn't human. Its limbs were too long, its movements too fluid, like it was made of smoke and bone rather than flesh. Its face, if it had one, was lost in the shifting mist, an ever-changing blur of darkness. I clamped a hand over my mouth to keep from screaming. The figure took another step forward, then another. The fog curled around it like living tendrils, shifting and writhing. I stayed in the cabin all night, curled in the corner, too afraid to move. Every so often I heard the floorboards creak, as if something was testing the walls, waiting, watching. When the sun finally rose, the fog lifted, and the figure was gone. The forest, once a prison of shadows, now looked ordinary again. I didn't waste time questioning my luck. I found the trail and ran until I reached my car. I don't remember the drive home, only the overwhelming relief of seeing civilization again. I've never gone hiking alone since, but sometimes, when the autumn fog rolls in, I feel it. The weight of unseen eyes watching from the trees. And in the distance, beneath the whisper of the wind, I hear a low, guttural laugh. Number 3. I thought I was alone in the forest, until the fog started whispering my name. It was my first time camping alone, and I'd chosen a spot deep in the Adirondack Mountains. The forest was beautiful, with towering pines and a crystal-clear stream running through it. I'd been looking forward to this trip for weeks, a chance to disconnect from the noise of everyday life and just be alone with nature. I set up camp in a small clearing, the perfect spot with just enough space for my tent and a fire pit. The sun was warm, the birds were chirping, and everything felt right. But as night fell, the atmosphere changed. The forest grew unnaturally quiet, the usual nighttime sounds replaced by an oppressive silence. It was as if the entire woods were holding its breath. I tried to brush it off, telling myself it was just my imagination, but the unease stayed with me. I built a fire to keep warm and sat close to it, the flames casting flickering shadows on the trees around me. Around midnight, I woke up to the sound of footsteps outside my tent. They were slow and deliberate, crunching against the dry leaves and twigs on the ground. My heart raced as I lay there listening. I told myself it was just an animal, a deer, maybe, or a raccoon. But the footsteps sounded too heavy, too human. I grabbed my flashlight and unzipped the tent, peering into the darkness. The beam of light cut through the trees, but there was nothing there, just the endless shadows of the forest. I stood there for a moment, my breath visible in the cold night air, before convincing myself I was imagining things. I zipped the tent back up and tried to sleep, but the sound of footsteps lingered in my mind. The next morning, I woke up feeling uneasy, but determined to make the most of my trip. I spent the day exploring the area, hiking along the stream and taking photos of the stunning fall foliage. But as the sun began to set, the feeling of dread returned. The forest felt different, darker, heavier, as if it were closing in around me. That night, the footsteps returned. This time they were louder, closer. I lay in my sleeping bag, my heart pounding, as the footsteps circled the tent. Then they stopped, right outside. I could hear breathing, slow, ragged breaths that didn't sound human. I clutched my flashlight, too afraid to move, too afraid to make a sound. The breathing stopped, and for a moment there was silence. Then I heard it, a low, guttural growl, so deep it vibrated through the ground. I don't know how long I lay there, frozen with fear, before I finally worked up the courage to unzip the tent and look outside. The fire had died down to embers, casting a faint glow over the clearing. At first I saw nothing. Then I noticed the trees. Their branches were moving, twisting and writhing like snakes. The growl came again, louder this time, and I realized it was coming from the trees. I stumbled back into the tent, my hands trembling, and grabbed my phone. No signal, of course. I was completely alone. I don't know how I managed to fall asleep, but I woke up the next morning to an eerie stillness. The forest was silent, the air thick with tension. I packed up my camp as quickly as I could, my hands shaking as I rolled up my sleeping bag and dismantled the tent. As I hiked back to my car, I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. The trees seemed to close in around me, their branches reaching out like skeletal fingers. I walked faster, my footsteps crunching against the dry leaves, but the feeling only grew stronger. Then I saw it, a figure standing between the trees. It was tall and thin, its body obscured by the shadows. Its face was hidden, but I could feel its gaze on me, cold and unyielding. I froze. My breath caught in my throat as the figure took a step forward. I didn't wait to see what it would do. I ran, crashing through the underbrush, my backpack bouncing against my shoulders. The figure didn't follow me, but I could feel its presence behind me, watching, waiting. I didn't stop until I reached my car, my heart pounding, my clothes soaked with sweat. I threw my gear into the back seat and drove away as fast as I could, the forest fading into the distance behind me. I've never gone back to that clearing, and I never will. But sometimes, late at night, When the wind rustles through the trees outside my window, I hear it again, that low, guttural growl, calling me back to the woods. Thanks for watching. If you enjoyed, please like and subscribe and consider checking out my other videos.